Presentation, if not a bit depressing. But Helen, to you to come on stage and share your screen.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lise. Hi everyone. I'm a researcher at Utrecht School of Economics and Sustainable Finance Lab in the Netherlands. And I'm gonna share some of my work on urban nature-based solutions. Let me see if it's gonna come online. Yes, so you should be. Otherwise, please let me know, Lise, but I'll start. This work is a joint work with two colleagues at Durham University. We're together in a large European Horizon 2020 project aimed at mainstreaming urban nature, nature-based solutions. And I'm leading the work on finance and business models for urban nature-based solutions. And this is actually the result of 2 years of empirical research on the finance topic that I'll present here today. So just to give you a brief summary of the paper, it focuses on access to public and private finance for urban nature-based solutions, which has been identified as a critical barrier for renaturing cities, not only in Europe, but also worldwide. But we're able to provide the first European cross-country analysis for mainstreaming urban nature through the financial domain. So there are two parallel studies carried out in our group, also in the regulatory domain and the design and construction domain. But specifically for the finance domain, we are able to formulate 7 transition pathways or strategies to finance the mainstreaming of urban nature-based solutions in Europe. And what we're currently still working on is to use this case to illustrate the role of the financial domain in sustainability transitions more generally. So throughout the presentation, I've added some pictures because sometimes people have difficulty thinking about what urban nature could be in cities. So you get some inspiration on the right side of my screen. So how are nature-based solutions defined? They're very much seen as solutions that are inspired and supported by nature. An important difference to other similar terms like biodiversity or ecosystems is that nature-based solution very much looks at nature as a solution for some issue, in this case, urban sustainability challenge. And what's also often stressed is that they're supposed to be very cost effective because of all the simultaneous benefits they're able to generate. So one intervention can realize, for example, water management in cities. It can help combat urban heat. It can help get to grow social cohesion. So there's a lot of different benefits. And one of the key questions that was asked also to the projects that are currently running is, how can you turn urban nature-based solutions into bankable opportunities? So, and how can you also leverage private capital flows? Because public finance is not going to be enough to renature our cities to the extent that we need. So that's the focus of this paper. Is we're looking at the strategies or the pathways that can be that we can identify to unlock finance to facilitate the mainstreaming of urban NBS. And we've been building this up from the sustainability transitions literature. And if you look at it from a very kind of flat perspective, the finance for MBS, it's often referred to in terms of lack of resources and lack of return. So it's unclear what private investors will get out of urban nature. And even for public finance, it can fall outside of public departmental funding scope. So the water department has a budget and the greening department has a budget, but they can't. They have difficulty putting together the business case. But we recognize that the financial domain can really help drive this sustainability transition and should therefore be studied separately. Also because we expect there to be less visible pressures in terms of institutional structures, conventions, and landscapes that need to be targeted to solve this issue. And there is some mention of the financial domain in the sustainability transitions literature, more implicitly. So a lot of the policies in sustainability transitions, they aim to influence the direction of investments, like R&D funding and state loans, in order to accelerate niche development, but also subsidy and tax reform to destabilize incumbent regimes. And it's also known in this literature that there are certain institutional rationalities that can diffuse worldwide through powerful actors, and that can also include large international banks. But what we're trying to do here is to really increase our understanding of the role of finance. We use a multiple case study approach. We went to 6 different European countries to do on-the-ground research, and also did that EU level. So we did desk study, we did interviews in each country and participant observation. We then analyzed all this data first at a country level with a set analytical framework. And then when we had every country level analysis carried out, we made a cross-case comparison to draw out general patterns in terms of conditions, challenges, opportunities, and then stepping stones, which we formulate kind of as actionable activities that can be taken in response to the challenges and opportunities. And we use these stepping stones to form clusters, which then help us define overarching pathways. And you see very small in your screen part of the visualization of how we did that. So very short, I'm going to give you the high level findings that we got out of this analysis. So the first one is that indeed almost all respondents, they give back, well, you know, if we want investors to really step into urban nature, then we need to do something about the lack of convincing direct cash flows of financial return. As one of the interviewees nicely said, the birds are not going to pay for it. But what's very interesting, and that also contrasts to more the kind of renewable energy transition, is that urban nature, it can become cost effective, but this cost effectiveness is based on multiple benefits. And these multiple benefits, they land with different actors. So in order to actually make it cost effective, you have to coordinate the co-funding, and that is very challenging, and that's not happening at the moment. Furthermore, for stakeholders to invest in urban nature, there's evidence missing. And what's also the case is that urban nature, the effectiveness of urban nature very much depends on local climatic and urban conditions. So a green roof in Spain will have another type of impact than a green roof in Sweden, for example, simply because the climate is so different and the urban sustainability issues are different. What we also see is that urban nature competes in the city for increasingly expensive urban space, for building development, which is fueled by several things, but also by financial markets. We see, especially in some countries, this was, for example, in the UK and in Hungary for other reasons, there's lack of public funding due to either austerity, low economic growth, and sometimes corruption. A key issue coming out across countries is the maintenance of urban nature. It has a different cost structure than gray infrastructure, which means that then stakeholders hesitate to take these on board. And finally, we see a mismatch between the investments that are required into urban NBS on the one hand, and then the institutional investor demands on the other hand, which require more scale, higher return, standardization, and transparency. Luckily, we also found some strategies, some pathways that that can address at least some of these challenges, which I'll go through very quickly now as well. The first one is that there's an opportunity to position urban nature as a climate change adaptation intervention. So it can deliver quite some benefits that are needed for climate change adaptation. So responding to extreme heat, to extreme water flooding, for example. So it can lower the risks of objects that are in the city. In that sense, that's one way to get more finance into urban nature. Also, we see that developing kind of these co-funding governance mechanisms for urban NBS is key. And we have also some really nice examples where this is happening at different scales, either with crowdfunding or with water funds. And this really seems to help build the business case for urban nature. What we also see is that in some countries, more developed than in others, there is no net loss regulation or even net gain regulation in the UK, or land value taxation, so ways to kind of include the conservation of biodiversity into urban development. Knowledge tools will definitely help investors also invest into urban nature to offer indicators, evidence, transparency, and monitoring. We see a pathway that's guided more by regulatory and supervisory action. So, for example, what the task force for the TCFD is doing, and certification schemes, so ways to really kind of quantify risk that urban nature can then respond to. We also see that the reinsurance sector can take up a role in upscaling urban nature because of their awareness and also buy-in to the risk. So it's very important to them. And finally, we also see an opportunity for increasing cost effectiveness of urban NBS investments by integrating them into planned infrastructure and real estate projects. So that's a whole big bunch of strategies. I'd just like to finish with one illustrative case, which is the green roofs in the Netherlands. So not all these strategies will work for all kinds of urban nature in all countries, but just to show how this would work, for example, for green roof in the Netherlands, what we see here is that in the Netherlands, there are multiple benefits of green roofs being recognized. There's this nice picture here where all these benefits are kind of quantified, but still we see a reluctance to pay the bill for green roofs. And partly this is due to lack of evidence on effectiveness, but also maintenance costs are a key issue for uptake of green roofs. We see three promising pathways in this domain. So creating evidence, this is happening for green roofs in the Netherlands, but we also see the insurance sector engaging. So this is very much still a niche, but they're interested in reducing damage costs from roofs. So green roofs act as a protection. And finally, we see some coordinated funding attempts. So these are some of the pathways that are being developed. Yeah, so my time is up. I can talk more about this, but thanks a lot for listening, and I pass it over to Lisa.
Really, really terrific. Thanks a lot. And one thing to flag at the end of the session, when we close, we can run over a little bit, but when we close, I've encouraged all of the speakers to pick a table, and hopefully people who are watching the presentations will join them at a table and continue the dialogue there. Now, why don't we turn to Hugues to join and talk at kind of a much bigger picture perspective on these questions. Great, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Liz, and hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well and see my screen now. Let me get rid of that. So, yes, indeed, my view today is a bit broader. I will talk essentially about the financial system perspective through regulation and the intervention of central banks and financial supervisors. My work actually relates to, my presentation relates to some work we've done with my colleagues Josh Ryan Collins, Frank Van Lerven, Dick Edward. I will highlight two papers that we published recently, two working papers, and so my presentation today is really related to those, a mix of those two papers. So, okay. So the good news to start with is that climate change as a systemic threat is now widely accepted by financial regulators and supervisors. That's actually the reason why the NGFS has been built. It's a network of central bank and supervisors for greening the financial system. And I actually quote one of the first reports saying that about climate change risk and time horizons, the risk call for action in the short term to reduce impact in the long term. So that's a very strong statement, which is really aligned with the IPCC publications on climate science. But starting with that, just after we have maybe an issue in the fact that it seems that the action itself, regulatory action in policy intervention, seems to be delayed because, and I quote again the same report, there is a need to build intellectual capacity in translating the science into decision-useful financial risk assessment information, which means basically that we need to act, but before to act, we need more information, we need more data, we need more models, we need more results. And we think that is a problem because, in fact, we are delaying the decision here. And as a result, so far, from the NGFS perspective, but also from central banks themselves, especially in developed countries. I quote here the Bank of England, the Banque de France, etc. They issue voluntary guidelines and tend to focus on stress testing and scenario-based risk analysis. So analysis more, so it's this quest of new information. It's not really, okay, we are going to do this type of policy and implement it at that day or in that time horizon. And so we think it raises lots of questions, because when will such an intellectual capacity be reached? Nothing is really written about that. It can be tomorrow morning, maybe, but it can be in several years or decades. And especially about scenario modeling and stress testing, that's really interesting tools to dig into. I'm very interested personally into that. I worked on this already, so I don't want to say that's bad, don't do it. But what do they mean for policy intervention? Is it just about sending useful signals to market? Or is there a question of having results as a prerequisite for taking financial policy decisions? Typically on stress testing, long time horizon stress testing, what are we going to stress test? Today's balance sheet for an horizon of 50 years, or a future balance sheet that we have to imagine, that we have to model before to stress test? And it raises, as you see, lots of very complex questions. And in the meantime, while we try to address those questions, we don't take decisions. We don't intervene in the financial system. And not intervening there is really a choice. It's it's a choice to not intervene, and it carries risk, and it's really aligned with the conclusions of the IPCC. I just quote a sentence here: delaying action implies escalating costs and risks, right? So very quickly on the natures of climate-related financial risk. Very quickly, they are very different from the usual risks, financial risks that are taken into account and potentially managed by the financial system, essentially for many reasons, but essentially for the fact that they are very long-term oriented and unprecedented. We don't know what can and what will happen and how exactly how to quantify that. That's the problem. And we have a lot of layers, I would say, of uncertainty attached to them. The first one being related to the physical understanding of climate change, but that's actually what we know the best in this list. And the most complex is actually coming from the socio-economic uncertainty. There are literally an infinity of scenarios, of possible scenarios, an infinity of possible futures we have to consider, right? Especially in the long term, of course, not for tomorrow morning. And the related emission pathways are even more uncertain. What will be the impact of the socio-economic reaction on the climate? And the policy tool uncertainty is even an additional layer. We don't know exactly how the policies we have in mind will have any effect. And so we have basically, we suggest to try to test and not just to wait to be sure of what will be the impact. I will come back to that. So anyway, this level of very high complexity and multiplicity brings what we call a radical uncertainty. And actually, here I was just talking about climate, but it's even much more complex if we broaden the perimeter to other types of environmental threats. And climate is, as I said before, probably the one that we know the best, because just as an example, the IPCC, for example, has been created more than 32 years ago. So it's something we know. We know a lot of things about climate related to biosphere or other problems. And think about the COVID crisis here. It's an interaction about a lot of things, and we don't really know what will happen. So To come back to the classical difference between risk and uncertainty. So 1 century ago, basically, Frank Knight articulated the two. On the one hand, risk, which financial sector is used to deal with, is basically a space where you can make models, where you can calculate probabilities and take decisions based on that. Whereas when you are facing uncertainty, it means you don't have a reliable estimate. You don't have probability distributions. And so for climate-related financial risks, the level of radical uncertainty I quickly described before means that in a number of situations, the unknowns we are talking about are just impossible to calculate. It's not probability risk distributions. And actually, we are not the first one to say that, and it's even acknowledged in a lot of papers related to that, including in the NGFS itself, which mentions those unknowns that are impossible to calculate, significant gaps in the literature, tipping points, feedback effects that are very complex to take into account. So what we propose then as a solution is to change the mindset, not to rely only on quantitative modeling to take financial policy related decision. And for that, we pushed the idea of a simple precautionary approach, right, which is actually made to deal with that level of uncertainty. And the option here is not to, the idea here is not to define a particular policy or regulation type. It's just the kind of mindset to trigger the policy action. So it's just an enabler. It's a condition to take policy decision. And typically it's to kind of fight against the usual conclusion in a lot of work, in a lot of research of policy documents saying more research is needed. So we say no, for climate, essentially, more research is not needed. We know the level of threat is enough to start trying to take decision. Not, okay, we have a wonderful, easy idea about what to do, but start to do and to implement policy interventions. So it's quite a classical thing in environmental regulation. Basically, it means we need to precautionary approach means we need to anticipate harm before it occurs and not wait for emergency crisis management. So think again about the COVID situation. We can wonder if we are in a precautionary situation or an emergency risk management. It's a bit of the two, of course. And the principle itself is really insisting on not postponing action and not taking the excuse of waiting for a better scientific understanding. Then to come back to our financial system regulation issues, actually we have a set of tools and framework which totally fits with that, which is called the macroprudential policy. If you look at the different characteristics and items of macroprudential policy, it fits what we just described in terms of uncertainty, of systemic, of endogeneity situations. So in terms of being preemptive and taking decisions, policy interventions, using the macroprudential framework is actually sound and should be the first thing to try to do. Basically, it means two main types of approach. On the one hand, mitigation of those risks, and on the other one, adaptation to their materialization, because whatever we do, there will be some risk materializing, whether from the physical side or from the policy itself. Basically, it means, to support the decarbonization, either through supporting some economic activities or through penalizing or prohibiting them. And the financial policy and regulation should contribute to that. And in the meantime, we have to improve the financial system resilience, both at micro and macro scale. So it's the two sides have to be taken together. I'll be very quick on that. It's a first list of things that can be done, but actually, as I said earlier, our purpose, our message is not to describe what can be done, but rather to say we have things that can be done. So start to try to do it. It's about triggering the policy decision making process. It's not about the decision themselves, which are basically which are also documented in a lot of papers and reports these days. So typically it opens the way to a very new types also of policy action. And even at the NGFS level, I highlight here two sentences: limiting or prohibiting financial institutions from carrying out certain categories of activities is now in the list of things that can be undertaken by financial supervisors. And to finish, because I'm already a bit late on my time, what we need is, as I said earlier, to change our mindset and not think only about quantitative modeling to take policy and regulation and supervision decision. Think about the COVID-19 situation. A lot of qualitative approaches have been taken by policymakers, even by the European Central Bank. Remember, 6 months ago, on March the 12th, the ECB put 120 billion euros on the table for asset purchase intervention. It was on a Thursday, right? 120 billion. Less than 1 week later, on the 18th, the amount has been multiplied by about 750 billion. So from 120 to 750 in less than 1 week. Do you think those very, very strong policy decision intervention come from very precise quantitative modeling, or more things like rules of thumbs and learning by doing? So, of course, we think that this type of approaches, which so far are more related to a mix of prevention and emergency crisis management, have to be taken. So on other approaches, much more heuristics than relying on quantitative models. And I will end by quoting some of our colleagues from the BIS and Banque de France with their last Green Swan report, and especially the Green Swan 2, which is a shorter paper published about the COVID crisis. And quoting Luis Pereira da Silva here, Green Swans, so what we are talking about here about climate risk for the financial system, call less for improvement in risk modeling and more for decisive and immediate action and coordination. So that's exactly the type of message we want to highlight here. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. And you can, why don't you just stay on, and then everybody else who presented, come back on screen, share your camera again. Great, thanks. And just a reminder to everybody watching, it'd be great if you could put your questions in the Q&A. A couple that people have entered, which is terrific. So keep adding those. And if you see a question that you like, you can also upvote that question, and that will come up to the top of the list. So speakers will see that. Get to that, I just wanted to give the presenters any time to either react to anything that they heard in the other presentations, or to add some additional thoughts about kind of next steps in their research on this topic. What were some of the key questions that your work opened up, and what are you pursuing in that respect? So maybe we'll go in the same order on those two general themes. If you have anything to say on the other presentations, and we'll give some people some more time to put their questions in the Q&A box. Carlos, we can start with you. Oops, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, the microphone wasn't set. Yeah, sorry, what was the question?
Oh, sorry, just a couple. Just an opportunity, if you had any reactions to the other presentations, or if you wanted to share just a couple of additional words on kind of next steps in your research that you presented. Okay, yes. Well, I think what you mentioned at the beginning was very significant to me on how all of these interconnected. And I think that's precisely the point. I think all of these presentations share the call for action. There's a lot of things we need to consider at the moment, and we have significant evidence of how much all of this will be having an impact, or is already having an impact in our life. And then what Hugh was mentioning also
on his presentation, putting it in context with the situation with COVID-19. I think it's nothing more current than this that tells us we just need to start considering how all of these not only brings very important challenges to us, but also brings interesting opportunities that we can start taking.
Great, thanks. And just to everyone as well, the room won't close for another 15 minutes, so I'm going to continue the session. If you have to leave, understandable, but we will continue a bit longer. Galina, how about you? Did you have anything that you wanted to supplement or react to?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I found all the presentations really interesting. Interesting was to hear what Carlos had to say about the end of life cycle. My presentation was about introducing more renewables to the capacity mix, and you're already thinking ahead what to do actually with them. So yeah, there are a lot of questions actually one still needs to understand better. We are really trying to see where we can input in terms of closing the knowledge gap to expose those the gap between where we want to be and where we are realistically heading. So our work will continue on this, and we do that with data. So we are really keen to work with data-driven empirical approaches rather than maybe mostly hypothetical and scenario-based approaches, although those of course are also valid and necessary. So we really want to carve out and fill the niche to support policymakers and everyone else who is trying to project what the future might be like, especially for the continent like Africa, because obviously data is scarce on that continent, but this continent has a really important role to play in whether we meet or not our climate change mitigation objectives. Happy to react to the questions once we start answering.
Yeah. Great. No, and that was terrific. And I think that those points relate to a few things. What is the connection between the researchers and the policymakers, and what are the transmission channels, and how could those potentially be improved? And also, I mean, that there a lot of the papers, most of the papers did focus on maybe capital markets in the US and Europe. And there are huge gaps in terms of the areas of focus regionally, and also in the types of investments. So it's a really important contribution, your paper focusing on Africa. Helen, how about over to you?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting to see these papers together, seeing that the market needs some help to get it right. One of my main questions at the moment that you can wake me up for at night is how to get all these different stakeholders to coordinate their contribution. Because it really shows that, you know, just one public or private actor is not gonna get it right when it comes to urban nature, and this coordination is really important, maybe more so in biodiversity and nature than in the energy transition. Yeah, so how to organize that, I think, and how the public policy can play a role, I think that's really one of my big hairy questions. What I really like just a short comment on Yu's presentation, that you know, going beyond kind of the level of organizing, of thinking about return and risk at the firm level, but going to the systemic level, and to really take decisions in a different way. And I think that's also something that's happening in this biodiversity debate. So you know, we've been looking at disclosure of climate risks. But now also the Dutch Central Bank has issued a report on the material risk of biodiversity loss. And I think this is hopefully also going to make the market take this more seriously, that we really need to invest in natural capital, and otherwise it will have very material, it will have material effects. I saw two questions in the, shall I take those straight away or first, or in the second round?
Yeah, maybe let's do those in the second round. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Great. Jürgen?
Yes, no, very, very quickly, I think to come back to what I said and to what Carlos added, I think we have a sense of emergency that we tend to forget, especially in the research arena and in some policymakers or some regulators seen, which tries to calm down, to sit down, to think before acting, which is a wise habit. But sometimes we still need to have this sense of emergency. And I think the COVID is a good example, good but sad example, that sometimes we have to act and we'll adjust. But we have to act first and adjust while you continue to act. And learning by doing is something we need to start as a new process and not just learning. And so we should do a little more. And after, I think in terms of research for us, for our team and colleagues in other organizations, that's what we are focusing on. It's try to not to disconnect, but to articulate the pure knowledge and how to use maybe simpler knowledge, but things that we already have. And just sticking back to the IPCC, reports should be enough knowledge to have financial regulators and supervisors starting to take concrete decision and not just trying to improve their models.
Great, thanks. Carlos, then why don't we go back around and everybody can take some time to tackle the questions that were directed toward them. Yeah, so Carlos, why don't we start with you?
Don't seem to find them here in the chat.
Okay, so there's, it's in the Q&A, and it's just in terms of estimating cost of different scenarios, how do you take into account externalities and who will bear those, especially since some recycling methods can produce harmful emissions?
Yeah, well, it was actually some of the tricky part that we found with the information that we were working with. From the perspective that we are doing for this particular paper, the perspective is purely financial, and we incorporate some of these elements in different ways. In the case of the externalities of pollution that results out of the process per se, the way it was incorporated into it was by adding cost into the cleaning of plastics. And perhaps I'm getting a little bit too technical, but that's basically what happened. Why? Because there's some significant efficiency into recovering a lot of the materials that are part of the panels, which actually account for the majority of the volume of the panels per se. So all the metals, copper, aluminum, and also glass are very easy to recycle, if we may, and actually recover most of it. Most of the environmental impact actually comes from plastics, because plastic is also used for this overall process. And then that it actually doesn't generate a positive result, let's say. It doesn't generate income. It just results into additional cost into the process. And we had to consider it as cost since this was an economic approach. But then again, still further involvement into it can be done for assessing deeper externalities.
Great, great. Thanks a lot. Galina, I think there were a couple of questions to you as well.
Yes, sure. There was a question on the use of the logistic regression, LOGIT, and the environmental policies, or the enabling policy environment. Well, on the logistic regression, great question. First of all, we have actually run an analysis with LOGIT and found that the predictive performance of the gradient and boosted trees based model is superior to that. And that's for a number of reasons. First, we saw a lot of nonlinear relationships between the features and the prediction. So so the GBT, the gradient and boosted trees, are actually better suited to capture those nonlinear relationship. Also, they are really becoming the state of the art in the predictive space. They deal well with a number of other data issues, missing values, the multicollinearity. So, and another thing I wanted to point out is what we use is actually machine learning based models are no longer black box. There's a good way to interpret those models, for example, through sharp values, and that's what we did. So they actually allow to unpack the effects of individual features on the prediction. So not only make the prediction, but also understand the drivers behind that. So this is on that. And on the enabling environment, also great question. There are obviously a lot of factors at play, and not per se in terms of predicting which plants will go online or not. We actually included, I think there's some echo. One of, I guess, someone's microphone is on. Can you still hear? I hope. So the key is basically we included policy-related variables in our model. I tried to predict, but actually their importance wasn't that great for the prediction, because what we think the policies actually affect mostly which plants are planted in the first place, and not which will be realized, because obviously the effect of policies wears off over time in terms of the success of plants. So policy environment is really important to make sure that the right projects are planned, not that much to increase the commissioning chances. And obviously what Giorgio said this morning as well, what we need to do is at the minimum stop financing fossil fuels, and especially through development finance, because we saw in our model that development finance has an important role in project success. So channeling that away from fossil fuel based projects towards renewables at a minimum, that, and obviously dismantle fossil fuel subsidies as well. So it's not only about actually the enabling policy environment in terms of promoting renewables, but the other side of that debate is the fossil fuels. We should stop supporting the expansion of fossil fuels. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And Helen, a couple questions for you. We'll kick us out at 3:45, so maybe just a couple of minutes, and then turn to Uge so that we don't end right as somebody's speaking. So just be a little bit mindful of the time, and then hopefully we can get everybody's thoughts out and questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be really brief. There's a question from Arjen about the societal benefits of urban nature and the quantification. I think there's two answers to that. One is that there's a lot of literature on things like willingness to pay for urban nature, or things like house values. So how house values go up because of urban nature. So more kind of the general value of nature. And the second work that's being done is the value specific to actors. So for example, the reinsurer in France that is calculating a reduction in damage costs in a renatured area, which is prone to flooding, for example. And then you see that the context specificity of this data is really important as well. And the second question of examples of NBS included into investment portfolios, there are a couple of nice examples. So there's the Natural Capital Finance Facility of the European Investment Bank. They've invested into green infrastructure in Athens. In Sweden, we found some examples of green bonds being put out by municipalities that included also green infrastructure. And for example, Manchester municipality has set up a natural capital investment fund also to attract kind of private capital into their infrastructure. So those are just a few examples on that. So I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks.
Yes. So yes, thank you for these questions. Thank you, Arjan, for your questions. Very quickly, no, of course, financial regulation is not the only tool. So it has to be seen as a complementary to the rest. And actually, it probably should not be the first thing. I think industrial policy is something much more core to our problem than financial policy. But now that financial regulators are there, concerned and realizing that they have a role to play, they mustn't miss the opportunity either. And they have a huge role, but they should not be alone, of course, to act. And on the question of radical uncertainty, same, I've been quite quick in my presentation, but what is very key now is to distinguish where we are facing radical uncertainty and where it's risks that we can calculate and try to manage. And so typically if we try to model the effect of whatever action tomorrow morning, it's very different than the same effect of the same policy if it's implemented in 50 years, because in 50 years, we have no clue about what will be the situation to stress. And so situations are very different, essentially, because of these time horizon questions. And so I think the priority is now to articulate the different zones, the validity domains of such quantitative approaches to deal with radical uncertainty. And I stop there to leave 1 minute.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the presenters and the participants for the excellent questions. Yeah, really enjoyed that. A lot of food for thought. So thanks. And hopefully you can, again, mingle in the room. If you picked a table that you'll be at, do you want to say where you'll be? Did you all pick a table where you'll be that people can come find you? No? How about Carlos be at 1, Galina 2, Helen 3, Hugo 4, and then you can all pick a table if you want to chat further. Find them there. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Lisa.